So I thought that Judge Dredd was related to Dredd from 2012. I also thought that Judge Dredd wasn't going to be that good in comparison to Dredd from 2012. Now, I wasn't entirely wrong when I thought that. There were so many things wrong with this movie and parts of it that I just laughed at how stupid it was, but I legitimately thought that Judge Dredd was a decent movie. So before we get into what I loved, let me tell you about what I hated about this movie. I didn't like that Judge Dredd opens in the most unnecessary way, with subtitles and a voiceover in the background to accompany it. Now, I wasn't a fan of this because it's just awkward in a movie to have both of those things in the opening. You either have subtitles to explain what happens, or you have a voiceover accompanied with images that pair well with the voiceover. I didn't see why it was necessary to open the movie with both of those things, because there have been many movies over the years that have done this, like the early Disney movies, Star Wars, and the movie Legend, just to name a few. And we've had some really good movies that start off with narrations such as Fight Club or the first Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. But let's actually think about one of my personal favorite sci-fi movies, the first Terminator, as an example. In my opinion, Terminator had just enough words on screen to get the point across to the audience, and if somebody had been reading that off at the same time, it wouldn't have added anything to it. It would have only taken something away, because the words by themselves held so much weight to them that we wouldn't have needed anybody to read off those words to us. It was like reading a journal entry from somebody who had lived through all the horror, knew what all had happened, and what they were told was going to happen. And we, the audience, were all reading it for ourselves, and not having someone read it to us carried a lot more weight to it. But this whole dislike for the subtitle and narration thing in Judge Dredd is just a minor detail in a movie that was very good overall. I do find it interesting that this movie also opens with what is now similar to the Marvel Studios opening of a comic book flipping sequence. I honestly think that Marvel stole that from the opening sequence in this movie. And outside of the subtitles and narration sequence, I think Judge Dredd had a pretty good opening. From the moment the movie actually starts, opens with a flying cargo ship, and Judge Dredd from that point forth in the whole movie, it looked to me like a mixture of a generic action movie from the 80s and 90s, combined with a modern-day Marvel movie and an old Star Wars movie. Now look, when compared with Dredd, which came out 17 years after Judge Dredd, I think that both movies were good in very different ways. Both movies have very different looks, different feels, styles, and stories that you wonder how the hell they could be so different from each other and still came from the same comic book universe. Now, keep in mind, I haven't read any of the comics of Dredd because I don't really care about comics unless you're talking about manga. Anyway, that being said, I liked both movies, but for now I will just be focusing on Judge Dredd. Now, I thought that Judge Dredd looked pretty damn good. The special effects still hold up pretty well by today's standards. The costumes of the judges looked stupid because tactically they were just illogical to have for both a movie and for battle purposes. But I think that one of the best looking things in this movie was Mean Machine. The costume and makeup on that guy looked awesome. That is exactly the kind of side villain that I want to see in a movie. But now, let's talk about the story a bit. I thought that Judge Dredd actually had a really well-written script. I mean, yes, there were some extremely cheesy lines, and there were some things that were said in the movie that in the end just didn't make sense. The perfect example of cheesiness would be like when Dredd was talking to someone who had done something wrong and was saying to them, "How do you plead? Not guilty." "I knew you'd say that." And other than the cheesy stuff or the really stupid lines, I really thought that the dialogue was on point and the characters were very well written. And I especially really liked the villain Rico. He had an interesting worldview, and Armand Assante played the role with a cruelty and a ferociousness that reminds me of Immortan Joe from Mad Max Fury Road. Now this movie, Judge Dredd, is your typical 80s, 90s action flick. It really did have a well-written script, and I don't understand how anyone disliked this movie outside of the fact that it doesn't follow the comics. Judge Dredd is a really well-written movie that is very enjoyable. And here's the thing. Do not go in thinking this movie has the same weighted feeling as Dredd. You have to go in looking at it with a much more lighthearted attitude. Judge Dredd gets 4.0 stars out of 5. Judge Dredd, from the moment the movie actually starts, opens with a flying cargo ship, and Judge Dredd, from that point,